Hello, welcome to the A Book a Day channel. This video's book review is about debt, which discusses the 5,000-year history of debt in human society. The author is the famous American anthropologist David Graeber. I specifically consulted a professor specializing in anthropology, who told me that David Graeber is one of the most well-known internet celebrities in this field. He was very active on social media before his passing. Graeber was also one of the organizers of the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it is said that the slogan "We are the 99% was proposed by him. Due to his involvement in the Occupy Wall Street movement, Graeber was dismissed from Yale University and later joined the London School of Economics as a professor of anthropology. In September 2020, at the age of 59, Graeber passed away unexpectedly. Debt is his most important work published during his lifetime. Additionally, Graeber also published a best-selling book titled Bullshit Jobs, in which he introduced the famous bullshit jobs theory. So, what exactly does debt talk about? Let's start with the title of the book, What is Debt? Literally, owing debt means one owes something to someone else. However, Graeber believes that not everything owed can be called a debt. It's different from owing favors, gratitude, or responsibilities. There are two distinctions. First, favors, gratitude, and responsibilities cannot be precisely calculated, just like we cannot exactly calculate how much we owe our parents. While debt can be precisely calculated, it only requires knowing the principal, interest rate, and penalties. Second, favors, gratitude, and responsibilities are tied to specific individuals and cannot be transferred, while debt is depersonalized and devoid of emotional attachment, allowing it to be transferred and circulated. For debt to be precisely measured and circulated, currency is indispensable. Graeber believes that the essence of money is not as a commodity that acts as a general equivalent, but as a unit of measurement for debt. Just as meters measure length and seconds measure time, money originally served as a virtual unit to measure debt. Thus, the history of human debt is also a history of currency. In this book, Graeber proposes many revolutionary ideas. For example, we usually think that human society started with barter, gradually moved to cash transactions, and eventually developed credit economies and virtual currencies. But Graeber points out that the real history is the opposite. Human society first had credit economies and virtual currencies, then cash transactions, and large-scale barter is a relatively recent phenomenon. Why is that? Understanding this question will give you a grasp of the main thread of human debt history. Let me explain in detail next. Part 1. Open any economics textbook, and it will tell you that economic interactions in human societies began with barter. This idea originates from Adam Smith, the founding father of economics. Adam Smith believed that humans have a unique nature, which is the habit of bartering, exchanging one thing for another, and this is the foundation of all human societal functions. In Adam Smith's imagination, primitive societies operated like this. In a hunting tribe, all the men would go out hunting together. Gradually, one hunter discovers he is particularly skilled at making bows and arrows. If he focuses solely on making bows and arrows and exchanges them for other hunters' game, he would gain more than if he went hunting himself. Thus, this hunter becomes a craftsman specializing in making bows and arrows. However, back then, there was no currency, and he and his companions could only engage in barter, such as exchanging a bow for 2 goats or 10 rabbits. Obviously, barter was very inconvenient, so people started to use shells, metals, and similar items as mediums of trade, leading to the creation of currency. In short, this is a story of how primitive people living collectively slowly transformed into individual entrepreneurs, a story very much in line with our modern imagination. The inconvenience in trading was even packaged by economists into a sophisticated term called transaction costs. The only problem is, this common-sense story finds no basis in anthropology. Graeber says that for centuries, people have been desperately searching for the kind of bartering primitive tribes that Adam Smith described. However, according to records left by missionaries, adventurers, and colonists, no primitive tribe operates on an economic model of a bag of potatoes for a pair of shoes. So, how did primitive tribes actually operate? For example, in an African tribe, most goods were stored in a communal warehouse known as a longhouse, with the items distributed by a council of elder women. If a tribe member, let's call him Tom, needed a pair of shoes, he wouldn't have to exchange a bag of potatoes for them. Instead, Tom's wife would request the materials from the women's council and then retrieve them from the warehouse. Now, Tom has his new shoes and his neighbor Jack sees them and wants a pair too. What does Jack do? Does he exchange a bag of potatoes for Tom's shoes? No! Jack simply compliments the shoes and Tom, saying they were poorly made by his wife and offering them since Jack likes them, gives them to Jack. See, it's that simple. The bag of potatoes never gets a chance to enter the scene. Of course, now Jack owes Tom a favor. When Tom needs something, he'll naturally ask Jack for an axe, a basket of eggs, or something else. If Tom really can't part with his shoes, he can refuse to give them to Jack, thus owing Jack a favor. This means in a small, familiar society like a primitive tribe, people keep a mental account of who owes what to whom. However, they don't settle debts through barter. Instead, they let these favors continue to roll. The book cites an interesting example. An anthropologist gifted a beautifully crafted knife to someone in a tribe. A year later, upon returning to the tribe, they found that everyone had owned the knife for some time during that year. That is, because of this knife, everyone owed a favor and also owned a favor. Goods in a primitive tribe circulated in this way. In such tribes, saying a person doesn't owe anyone anything isn't praise, but criticism for being unneighborly and unfriendly. Of course, primitive tribes did occasionally engage in barter, but not with their own tribe members, rather with strangers or rival tribes. Barter meant a one-time settlement, with no further responsibilities or obligations between the parties. Given this, why not try to take advantage of the other party in a transaction? Indeed, linguists have found that in English, French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and other languages, the term barter implies deception, fraud, or swindling. This confirms that barter was a sporadic phenomenon, not a societal norm. So, did human societies ever engage in large-scale barter? Yes, but not in primitive societies. It happened in modern societies when people familiar with cash transactions, for various reasons, lacked sufficient currency and resorted to barter. For instance, when a country's economy suddenly collapses and its currency drastically devalues, people turn to barter, as happened in Russia in the 1990s and Argentina in 2002. Another example is prisoners of war camps, where prisoners, lacking currency, naturally resorted to barter, exchanging cigarettes for bread, coffee, etc., with cigarettes eventually becoming the camp's universal currency. This case indeed progressed from barter to currency, perfectly aligning with Adam Smith's conception of the origin of money. But don't forget, this happened to modern people. In primitive societies, there was no systematic barter, so how did currency appear? Anthropologists found that the items used as currency in primitive tribes were varied: shells, feathers, beaded necklaces, whale teeth, brass rods, purplewood rods, etc. Notice that, contrary to what we might think, the earliest forms of currency weren't practical items like salt, barley, or tobacco, but rather decorative items whose sole purpose was to make oneself look more attractive. For example, shells, feathers, necklaces were worn on the body. Brass rods were raw material for making copper bracelets. Purplewood rods were red pigments used as cosmetics. Interestingly, although these items could be considered primitive currency, they weren't used in daily goods circulation. That is, people in primitive tribes didn't use beaded necklaces or whale teeth to buy potatoes and eggs. So, what were these currencies used for? Anthropologists found that they were mainly used to rearrange relationships between people, especially in marriages and funerals. For example, many primitive tribes have the custom of dowries. A male suitor would bring valuable, beaded necklaces and whale teeth to the woman's family. If the family approved, they would send their daughter to the man's family. Does this mean the man bought the bride with a high price? Most anthropologists don't think so. If it were a purchase, it would imply that the husband had absolute power over the wife, including the right to buy, sell, or kill her. But in many primitive tribes, the relationship between husband and wife is basically equal. So, what is the nature of the dowry? Anthropologists believe it's a way of acknowledging a debt of favor. The man's dowry signifies that he acknowledges the value of what he's asking for is so precious it can never be fully repaid. Similarly, when a murder occurs within a tribe, the murderer's family must pay compensation to the victim's family, using currency like whale teeth or brass rods. This doesn't mean the money can buy a life, but rather acknowledges that the murderer's family owes an unpayable debt, preventing a blood feud. Supporting this in English, the word payment derives from the idea of pacifying or appeasing anger. To summarize, we've discussed two key points. First, there was no systematic barter in primitive societies, with economic interactions among acquaintances operating on the basis of owing favors. Second, currency didn't evolve from barter. In primitive societies, currency wasn't used to buy goods, but to create, maintain, or sever relationships between people. In other words, the emergence of currency had nothing to do with goods trading. They were two completely independent systems. The next question is, when did currency start being used for everyday goods trading? Let's continue discussing that next. Part 2. In this book, Graeber uses a very unique perspective to reorganize the entire history of human civilization, which is whether or not money is used for daily transactions. According to this criterion, human history can be divided into 5 stages. The first stage is 3500 BC, 800 BC, which is more than 2,000 years of the earliest agricultural empire era, corresponding to the Sumerian civilization in the West as well as the Xia and Shang periods in China. During this period, money was usually just a bookkeeping symbol and not much used for daily transactions. In other words, human civilization actually began with the credit economy and virtual money. The second stage is the period from 800 BC to 600 AD, which is known as the Axial Age, the time when Confucius, Siddhartha Gautama, and Pythagoras lived. Large-scale coinage sprang up during the Axial Age, and money began to be used in the daily circulation of goods. The third stage is the period from 600 to 1450 AD. These 800 years are commonly referred to as the Middle Ages, which corresponds to the Sui and Tang dynasties to the Ming dynasty in China. During the Middle Ages, money was gradually withdrawn from circulation and stored in temples, churches, and other religious sites on a large scale, and society returned to a credit economy and virtual money. The fourth phase was from 1450 to 1971, which Graeber called the Age of the Great Capitalist Empire. Due to the discovery of gold and silver mines in the Americas, the world began to readopt gold and silver as money on a large scale. Until 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon announced that the U.S. dollar is decoupled from gold. Virtual currencies make a comeback, which opened the fifth stage of human history. You see, the entire history of human civilization is the history of alternating virtual and physical currencies. This is Graeber's most central insight in this book, and I'll have to expand on it for you. Let's look at the first stage, the period of the earliest ancient agricultural empires. In the plains of Mesopotamia, the birthplace of Western civilization, the Sumerians left a complete set of credit records and monetary information in cuneiform. The basic unit of Sumerian currency was called the shekel, and 1 shekel of silver was equal to 60 portions of barley, which was the monthly wage of every laborer at the temple. Obviously, the shekel monetary unit was not developed for market transactions, but was directly established by the temple administrators, the Sumerian government officials, as a measure of the wages of the laborers. More importantly, the shekel was a virtual monetary unit, and silver coins such as the 1 shekel did not exist on the market. Silver did not circulate much in the daily life of the Sumerians, and silver bullion was kept tightly in the temple storehouse and rarely taken out. Sumerians only sickle as a unit of account, or more academically called scale of value, record who owed how much to whom. For example, if a Sumerian farmer wanted to go to a tavern to drink, he would simply give his name to the bartender and write down the bill, and then use the barley or other agricultural products to pay off the bill during the harvest season. The average Sumerian peasant never had access to a real piece of silver in his life, except at weddings. In other words, the Sumerians developed a credit economy from a primitive economy of favors that relied on a credit system, which, according to Graeber, was the earliest form of virtual money in human society. Do you realize that this is again contrary to our common sense? We usually think that human society started with large-scale cash transactions, and then slowly developed a tool called credit, which led to the creation of virtual money. The reality is that ancient agricultural empires operated on credit systems and virtual currencies from the very beginning. So, when did human society make the transition from virtual money to the large-scale use of minted money? This brings us to the second stage of human history, the Axial Age. One thing that is particularly strange is that the places where the saints of the Axial Age lived coincided with the simultaneous emergence of large-scale minting of money, such as the Yellow River Valley where Confucius lived, the Ganges Valley, where Siddhartha Gautama lived, and the Aegean coast where the Greek philosophers lived. Precious metals such as gold, silver, and copper, which had been stored in large quantities in temples and palaces, suddenly flowed into the people in large quantities and were divided up and minted into small pieces of coins for circulation. Why this sudden shift? The answer given by Graeber is that it was the government that strongly pushed the circulation of money. The Axial Age had one of the greatest characteristics, that is, it was full of violence and war, such as the chaos of the Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods in China, as well as the prolonged conquest between the city-states of ancient Greece. Take the ancient Greek city-states as an example. As a result of prolonged warfare, many Greek city-states needed to maintain a large army of mercenaries numbering up to tens of thousands of men. Just finding and transporting provisions for these men required hiring an equal number of laborers and livestock, which was a heavy burden on the government. Moreover, it would be very inefficient for the government to forcibly collect food and other supply items from the people. What to do? The best thing for the city-state government to do was to issue silver coins to the soldiers as pay, and then announce that the city-state would no longer accept physical goods for taxes, fines, etc., but only silver coins. This way, the soldiers could use the silver coins to buy whatever they needed from the people, and the people were willing to trade goods for silver coins because they needed them to pay their taxes to the government. In this way, the old credit economy disappeared and money became the protagonist in the circulation of goods under the strong hand of a militarized government. One illustration supports Graeber's inference. Minting money was the fastest to spread in the Greek city-states, which kept large mercenary armies, yet it was not popularized in places where the state was not founded on the military, but on trade, such as the city-states of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were regarded as the greatest merchants and bankers of the ancient West, but they were still doing business in the old-fashioned way of keeping accounts and relying on a credit economy. The earliest coins minted by the Phoenicians read, "For military use only." This could be further evidence that the large-scale use of money for the circulation of goods was not the result of the spontaneous emergence of a free market, but rather the result of a militarized government imposing itself. In the Middle Ages, however, the trend towards the mass use of money for the circulation of goods was reversed, and the credit economy and virtual money returned. Why was this? We know that the world's major religions, such as Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism, were basically born in the Axial Age, but their large-scale popularization took place in the Middle Ages. The large-scale popularization of religions brought about an unintended consequence, which was that there were fewer precious metals in circulation. In the Middle Ages, most of the minted coins ended up in religious places, such as churches, monasteries, and temples, either directly in cellars, melted down and plated on altars, or minted in the form of sacramental vessels and images of gods and Buddhas. This resulted in a severe shortage of precious metals in circulation, which in turn led to vicious deflation. In Chinese history, such as the Northern and Southern Dynasties period, and the Tang Dynasty, there were several large-scale exterminations of Buddhas, and Graeber argues that an important motivation for the government was to regain access to precious metals for minting coins. In Europe, people responded to the disappearance of minted money by returning to a credit economy. As we know, in the early Middle Ages, Charlemagne conquered much of Western Europe and standardized the system of weights and measures, prescribing monetary units such as pounds, shillings, and pence. Although this empire quickly fell apart for the next 800 years or so, which lasted throughout the Middle Ages, Western Europeans used this monetary system to keep their accounts. In the Middle Ages, pounds, shillings, pence, and other monetary units, and the Sumerian sickle, is a set of virtual monetary units, and the actual circulation of a variety of coins are two sets of systems. In the daily life of medieval Western Europeans, most transactions did not require cash, but only virtual money to keep track of the accounts, with a small amount of minted coins as a supplement. Therefore, you will find a very interesting phenomenon. The kings of medieval Western Europe frequently recalled the coins for restriking, but it would not affect the daily life of the common people much. It wasn't until the Europeans discovered the gold and silver mines of the Americas around 1450 that things began to change. The discovery of gold and silver mines in the Americas marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the era of great capitalist empires. We know that most of the silver from the Americas went to China. The Ming Dynasty was a period of population explosion in China, but it was also a period when the standard of living of the common people rose significantly, and the Ming Dynasty needed large amounts of silver as currency. After the Europeans discovered the silver mines in the Americas, China began to export large quantities of silk, ceramics, and other luxury goods to Europe in exchange for tons of silver. By the late 16th century, China was importing 50 tons of silver per year, accounting for 90% of the silver produced in the Americas each year. The rest of the silver went to Europe. From that time onwards, the countries of the East and the West successively entered the era of the silver standard, the gold and silver compound standard, and the gold standard. That is to say, the era of the great capitalist empires. Like the Axis era, money was used on a large scale for the circulation of goods. However, Graeber also reminds us that the two eras are fundamentally different. In the Axis era, money was only a tool for the empire to maintain its rule. However, in the era of the great capitalist empires, money itself seems to have a will, and the governments and armies of the capitalist countries are organized around money, and the logic of finance itself reigns supreme. This process of global monetization, Graeber points out, was interrupted again in 1971, when U.S. President Richard Nixon announced that the U.S. dollar had been formally decoupled from gold and that the Bretton Woods system had come to an end, marking the return of virtual money once again. It should be emphasized that the United States unilaterally announced the decoupling of the U.S. dollar from gold, which was a major breach of contract by the U.S. government to the rest of the world. In accordance with the Bretton Woods system, the United States' commitment of $35 to 1 ounce of gold, other countries only need to reserve dollars on it, do not need to reserve gold by the United States to unify the custody of the United States. Other countries in need of gold can always come to the United States government to exchange. But all of a sudden, the United States unilaterally announced that, sorry, you hand the dollar, exchange cannot gold, need gold, you go to the market to buy. This led to a surge in the price of gold, from $35 per ounce in 1971, rose to $600 per ounce in 1980. This meant a sharp depreciation of the dollar, foreign exchange stockpiled by governments, and a sharp increase in the value of the wealth owned by large gold reserve countries such as the United States of America and the United Kingdom. You see, the U.S. completed a new round of the great global wealth transfer through the decoupling of credit money from precious metals. Lost the anchor of value, the dollar, virtualization, and bubble characteristics more and more obvious. 2008, before the financial crisis, the Fed's total asset size of about $1 trillion. After the financial crisis of quantitative easing, so that the Fed's total assets quickly to $2.3 trillion. 2020, after the new crown epidemic, the Fed is to open the big water irrigation mode, the total asset size of up to $7.4 trillion, 12 balance sheet expansion of more than 6 times during the year. Graeber wrote this book when the United States is in 2008 after the round of quantitative easing. Graeber had already seen at that time the U.S. government issued a sky-high amount of national debt, simply do not intend to pay, but also impossible to pay. Graeber believes that the virtualization trend of the dollar from 1971 to the present is the beginning of another new phase of human history. What this phase is called, how long it will last, and where it will take human society, all of which is still unknown. Okay, let's review this briefly. First, there was no systematic barter in primitive societies, and economic interactions between acquaintances operated on the basis of mutual indebtedness. Second, money did not evolve from barter, but was created by governments and enforced by them. Third, a history of human civilization is a history of alternating virtual and physical currencies, and we are currently at the beginning of a new virtual currency phase. Finally, I'll share with you one more interesting little egg from the book. We know that Adam Smith's most famous example in The Wealth of Nations is the story of the Scottish pin factory. The pin factory greatly increased its productivity through the division of labor. But Graeber has shown that the Islamic philosopher Ghazali, who wrote The Recovery of Sacred Learning 700 years before Smith, told the exact same story of a pin factory that used 25 different processes to produce a single pin. Only, Ghazali used this story to illustrate the human nature of helping each other, while Adam Smith used it to illustrate the human nature of trading with each other. Which, in your opinion, is the more accurate understanding of human nature? Well, that's the essence of today's book, Debt. Congratulations, you've finished listening to another book.